The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer. This is one of my favorite books and probably the best nonfiction book that I've ever read. It is a massive book, over 1,000 pages, but it held my attention from the beginning to the end just because of the subject matter. The Rise of the Third Reich is fascinating because of the series of unlikely events that led an obscure Austrian painter to be the unquestioned dictator of all of Germany. Like, how did that happen? This is the book of all the details of how it happened and how the chess pieces moved around and all the backroom conversations that were being had among world leaders, and how Hitler led Germany into World War II. This is the story of politics, the dark side of charisma, and really a massive social experiment. Like how Hitler got the whole nation to follow him with his ideas. The book is uniquely good at accomplishing this because of the role of its author. William Shirer is an American who was in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, so he's writing about this and covering all this as it's happening. And so he's on the ground, he's talking to people, and he's seeing how Germany's reacting to these things that the Führer is saying. That also means that in this book, when he's talking about some historical speech that Hitler is giving, he'll occasionally jump in and say, I myself was at that speech, and I was no more than 20 meters away from Hitler, and I thought he was particularly lively this evening. So it's cool, like you get the historic account of what happened, and then you get like the first-hand, like this guy was there watching Hitler and all these Nazi leaders at the time. So I divide the categories of how interesting this book is into three: the rise, the middle, and then the fall. So first, the rise. It turns out that Hitler's father had a name change when he was 39, and that only happened because of something that his grandfather was doing at the time, some legal thing. And if that hadn't happened, then Adolf Hitler would actually have been born Adolf Schicklgruber. And there are a lot of people who speculate, would he have had the success that he ended up having if he had a different name? Hail Schicklgruber? Anyway, World War I is what really put Hitler on the political path, because before that he was in Austria and he wasn't having much success of anything. He was just frustrated at the world for not being the way that he wanted it. Then World War I happens and he gets this dose of national pride and this dose of national shame when Germany surrenders to the Allies, and they get the humiliating terms of Versailles. This is laying the groundwork for a lot of discontent in Germany, which is perfect for Hitler to capitalize on. So he starts rising in the ranks of the Nazi party circles. He does this beer hall push where he tries to take over the government with him and his 600 men, and it fails flat. It's a terrible failure. He goes off to jail, he gets a light sentence, and while he's in jail, he writes Mein Kampf. Before this, nobody heard of him, and afterward, he didn't have a big success in Germany, but at least people had heard of him, so his name's on the radar at least. Besides, people weren't interested in him because the economy was improving after the initial collapse after World War I. So if the economy is good, then you don't need this young upstart. Like, what's he good for? But then, after the economy collapses in the early 30s, Hitler has another chance. So in 1933, the Nazis take over the government, and Hitler is in position to start righting the wrongs of World War I. He's been gunning for war for quite a while, and he starts off with massive successes, even though he is massively outnumbered by allies in militarily speaking. He takes over Austria, he takes over Czechoslovakia, and all this time, people are getting nervous because they know he's kind of power hungry, even though he is insisting that all he wants is peace. Neville Chamberlain is the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, and he flies over to Berlin several times to talk to Hitler to make sure that we're not going to have a repeat of the First World War, which is strong in Neville Chamberlain's mind. This presents a funny situation, though, because if politics is sometimes a game of chicken. You want to threaten somebody with something, but you don't want the cars to actually collide. Neville Chamberlain really, really does not want the cars to collide, and Hitler does want the car to collide. So in that game of chicken, Hitler's going to win every time. And so that's what you see over and over again with Hitler just taking more and more land, which really helps them once war actually starts because he has more people, more land to capitalize on. So a drastic miscalculation by Neville Chamberlain, and you can't help but feel a little bad for him because his intentions were good, he was just playing with a crazy person. And the whole time that Hitler's doing these land grabs, it's a lesson in politics that he is just positioning himself as the non-aggressor every time. That's his motto. It's Poland's fault that he had to invade. It's France's fault that he had to invade, and it's all on them. And Germany just wants peace, and why can't people just let him have peace? It's absurd. And yet, when you have control of everything, when you're the dictator, you get to say what the truth is. And when you're in control of the military, then you have the ability to enforce it. This reminds me of a great quote in the book when he was talking about what it was like to be in Germany at this time. He's talking about Goebbels and all the propaganda that's going around. And here's what he says. I myself was to experience how easily one is taken in by a lying and censored press and radio in a totalitarian state. Though unlike most Germans, I had daily access to foreign newspapers, especially those of London, Paris, and Zurich, which arrived the day after publication, and though I listened regularly to the BBC and other foreign broadcasts, my job necessitated the spending of many hours a day in combing the German press, checking the German radio, conferring with Nazi officials, and going to party meetings. It was surprising and sometimes consternating to find that notwithstanding the opportunities I had to learn the facts, and despite one's inherent distrust of what one learned from Nazi sources, a steady diet over the years of falsifications and distortions made a certain impression on one's mind and often misled it. No one who has not lived for years in a totalitarian state can possibly conceive how difficult it is to escape the dread consequences of a regime's calculated and incessant propaganda. Often in a German home or office, or sometimes in a casual conversation with a stranger at a restaurant, a beer hall, or cafe, I would meet with the most outlandish assertions from seemingly educated and intelligent persons. It was obvious they were parroting some piece of nonsense they had heard on the radio or read in the newspapers. Sometimes one was tempted to say as much, but on such occasion one was met with such a state of incredulity, a shock of silence, as if one had blasphemed the Almighty, that one realized how useless it was even to try to make contact with a mind which has become warped, and for whom the facts of life had become what Hitler and Goebbels, with their cynical disregard for the truth, said they were. So once you have the press and the military, you can do anything you want. You can just keep giving yourself more power, and that's how you end up with a dictator. What's funny is the position that the German people were in. It was hard to argue against Hitler, one, because he had control of the press, control of the military, and you face serious consequences for standing up to them. But also, Hitler kept giving them successes. This was the antidote to all of the horrible things that had happened to them in World War I, like they were finally winning. You have to appreciate that from the German perspective, how good victory feels. Also, unemployment was basically non-existent under Nazi rule. There were lots of guarantees of food and all these things for the normal German citizens. Sure, he was being mean to minorities and Jews, but they were in the minority, and if you were just a normal German, that didn't affect you directly. Then we come to the fall. Hitler's had these amazing successes, defying all expectations, taking over France, Western Europe, and he basically seems invincible. So it seems that Hitler saw all these incredible successes and said to himself, well, I guess I'll be taking over the world then, because why not? So that's when he heads east into Russia, and there's the disastrous battle at Stalingrad. This is where his troops are decimated because of his stubbornness, his refusal to give the order to retreat, which would have been a whole lot wiser. He would have saved his army, he would have saved a lot of lives, but there was really no other reason than his peculiar stubbornness that these hundreds of thousands of Germans and Russians had to die. This is one scary conclusion of the book. You have these millions of lives being shattered, millions of people being killed, just untold, impossible to categorize levels of death, destruction, famine, just horrible crimes against humanity. And at the top of it all is this madman. It's just whatever whims he feels on that day. It's extremely scary. To give an example, he talks about the perspective of Dolores, a Swedish ambassador that talks to Hitler before all of this exploded into World War II. And he tries to calm Hitler down. And this is what Dolores wrote as a reaction. So he's having this meeting with Hitler, and here's what he says. Hitler suddenly got up and, becoming very excited and nervous, walked up and down, saying, as though to himself, that Germany was irresistible. Suddenly he stopped in the middle of the room and stood there staring. His voice was blurred and his behavior that of a completely abnormal person. He spoke in staccato phrases. If there should be war, then I shall build U-boats, U-boats, U-boats. His voice became more indistinct, and finally one could not follow him at all. Then he pulled himself together, raised his voice as though addressing a large audience, and shrieked, I shall build airplanes, and I shall annihilate my enemies. He seemed more like a phantom from a storybook than a real person. So you have a stereotype of a person like Hitler, and you think, it might have been different in real life, but I read things like that and I think, nope, that's exactly who he was. The stereotype that's in my head of just this crazy person. So a lot of times that is validated as you read some of these personal experiences. In the end, Hitler is losing the war and he refuses to acknowledge this fact. He still thinks that Germany is going to rise up out of the ashes and it's going to go through this time of trouble, but then it's going to come out on top once again. It's going to be a great triumph. And all the terrible defeats will only add to this triumph in the end. It's really just sad to see his mind collapse as it gets further and further along. Eventually he's in the bunker in Berlin and the Soviets are knocking at the door, and he has a big model of a city in Austria and he's redesigning it, and he's thinking about this museum that he's going to dedicate to himself. And he's shouting out commands to armies that don't exist anymore. Shirer calls this the atmosphere of an insane asylum. Hitler has reached the peak and he has fallen, and you get the sense that there's not much left in his brain anymore. He is completely unattached to reality. And so he kills himself and his wife, and so ends the life of one of the most evil men that has ever lived. It's hard not to come away with this book without an extreme distrust of politics, because politics is all about saying the pleasant thing, whether you mean them or not. It's a game of manipulation and trying to get people on your side through saying the pleasant thing. Mass manipulation is pretty easy, so user beware. Finally, I think a message of this story is that one man really can make a difference. There are a lot of different ways that Germany could have gone in the 1930s. They could have followed a more traditional route of a country. They had lots of political parties that were vying for power, and they could have held elections, and there would have been a season of one political party in power, then another. That could have happened. But then comes Hitler into the crowded beer hall in 1923. He jumps on a table, shoots his gun in the air, and says, actually, we're going to be taking history in a different direction. I'm going to give this book 5 stars.